Hi everyone, and welcome back to Lemon Dew. I'm Brie, and in today's episode, I'm going to be discussing more in part 2 of autism and work. So in the last episode, which was released 2 weeks ago, I was mainly talking about my experiences of being an autistic person who has been in and out of various types of employment. And of course, I went into detail about my current position in which I'm doing a full-time job as a receptionist for a local council. So in today's episode, I'm going to be discussing a bit more about issues that autistic people face when it comes to work, not just in terms of finding a job, but going through the interview process, the onboarding process, and actually trying to keep a job. So without further ado, let's begin. So finding a job in itself can be pretty difficult and easier said than done, considering that the job market changes on a regular basis. You often have certain industries that are in higher demand than others, and of course, with job postings being released, you have hundreds, if not thousands of candidates applying for one position. Now, if you are someone on the autism spectrum, or you know someone who is on the autism spectrum, then finding a job and maintaining it is even more difficult because there are a lot of barriers that autistic people face when it comes to trying to find a job. As of recently, I've been on a site called Reddit where I've been looking into topics regarding autism and work, as well as the topic of NEETs, people who are not in any form of education, training, or employment. I was mainly looking into experiences from other people with autism, and from what I've noticed, a lot of autistic people are either unemployed and on benefits, or in most cases are underemployed. There are some exceptions in terms of autistic people finding consistent employment, like with myself, for example. However, for autistic people who are often underemployed, there tend to be instances where they cannot work in certain environments, especially in full-time jobs, because a full-time job is just too much for them physically, mentally, and emotionally. You even have some cases where autistic people might not be able to do part-time jobs depending on where they're at on the spectrum, as well as the level of support that they require. So for example, you might have an autistic person who can't really cope with working for even 25 hours a week, and they have to reduce that amount of hours because of the fatigue. So I'm going to start off with discussing disclosing autism, and I suppose in a sense my previous experience in terms of recruitment might come in handy because I have a little bit of an understanding in terms of how employers can be when it comes to hiring candidates. So when it comes to disclosing autism, especially during the application process as well as the interview and hiring stages, it can be very difficult for certain individuals, and this is mainly because a lot of employers tend to react negatively. Now, from my experience when it comes to applying for jobs, I've always been upfront about disclosing, and this is purely because if I do have any issues that occur in the workplace where autism is a cause, that way employers can't discriminate, and that way there can be a workaround to support me at work. Now, of course, I am not really a people person. As mentioned in my previous episode, I have mainly survived working environments by masking. But then, at the same time, I suppose I've become used to being around people as I've gained some level of confidence when socializing. Although, again, not every autistic person is able to do this. And as mentioned in many episodes in this podcast, no autistic person is the same and everyone has different needs. So usually when it comes to disclosing, it's kind of a catch-22. So if you disclose that you are autistic, you will probably have a lot of employers that will either make discriminatory comments towards you, as in direct comments to your face, or they will do it behind your back. And in most cases, a lot of employers are not really aware of autistic traits, and I suppose the same thing applies to many disabilities in general. And I guess when it comes down to disclosing, you do have instances where autistic people might be undiagnosed, or if they are diagnosed, they just don't mention the disability at all because they might not want the employer to know and react a certain way. So, for example, you might have an employer who will be very patronizing to an autistic employee, treating them as if they're a child when they're not. And of course, the employee in question will often have to prove that they're just as capable of handling any job like any neurotypical person. Now, another thing when it comes to disclosing autism is that if the individual with autism doesn't mention their disability and something happens in the workplace which causes them to lose focus in their job, employers can easily fire that person. So if, say, for example, you've got an autistic person working in an office environment, and yes, I'm going to be using an office environment just as an example because I have worked in offices and that's where most of my work experience lies. So back to my earlier point, if an autistic person is working in a front-facing role in an office and they are face-to-face with a client who's being rude to them, they could easily have a meltdown and they would be in a position where they cannot concentrate on the task at hand because there's somebody coming into their face, shouting at them, swearing at them, and it gets to a point where they could have a panic attack or something and the whole situation just escalates. In some cases, you might have employers that are sympathetic, but in most cases, you will have an employer reprimand the employee because they broke down and practically had a meltdown when they were supposed to be doing their job. And of course, because of this, the employer can fire the individual, and the individual in question won't have a case when it comes to dismissal, which is because, this is because they never mentioned that they were autistic. But if they were to mention it, they would have a case in terms of unfair dismissal, depending on how the situation played out. And of course, with autism in itself, it is a protected characteristic under the 2010 Equality Act. And the same thing applies to many other disabilities, whether physical or hidden, and even mental health as well. So, if you have, say, depression or something, then that should be a protected characteristic. And legally, an employer should not fire you because of something you can't control. However, coming from experience doing recruitment, sadly, you do have employers that can sort of skirt around things. And when you're an employee who is left in the lurch, it can be very difficult to present a case. And then sometimes you just feel it's not really worth fighting for because your employer has already fired you, there's nothing you can do, and you're just going to have to sort of accept what the situation has come down to, which is honestly really sad. So another issue that autistic people face is not coming across very well in interviews. So usually when you go to a job interview, you will either come face to face with one interviewer or a panel of interviewers where they're asking you questions regarding your skills and experience, why you're fit for a job, your strengths and weaknesses, and of course you might have instances where you might have some scenario questions in the star format being thrown at you so that the employer/interviewer can test how you would handle yourself in the workplace. Now, with autistic people, although some, depending on needs, again, as every autistic person is different, are equally as capable of working like any other neurotypical person, interviews are often not the best way to test their skills. So the thing with job interviews is a lot of employers tend to use them as a personality test because they want somebody that they can easily gel with, and they want someone who ticks all the boxes in their criteria. Now, I've had my fair share of job interviews where I've been really nervous, and even if I know I have a good chance of getting a job, I am very nervous in every job interview I do. I mean, I've done quite a lot of job interviews since, I would say, 2018, when I started going into paid employment. And honestly, in a lot of job interviews, I've been very nervous because I go in, I don't have a lot of confidence in myself. I'm worried that I'm going to say the wrong thing. And then the eye contact doesn't help because I get more nervous when people are staring directly at me. So when it comes to job interviews, an autistic person might not be able to understand certain questions. And another issue is that a lot of them come across too honest. And this honestly applies to myself because I am a fairly honest person. So, if, say, an interviewer was to ask an autistic person, why do you want this job? They're probably going to say that they need money in order to pay for necessities. But the employer doesn't want to hear that. The employer wants an answer where the person mentions how the company values align with their own, how they want progression, how they want a challenge, etc., etc. And to top it off with interviews, aside from autistic people not being able to formulate the right answers to questions, sometimes they can't really articulate themselves, and you have some that would benefit more by showing practical skills. And the same thing also applies to eye contact, because obviously you have to maintain a form of eye contact in job interviews because you have to show that you care about making a good impression and that you're paying attention to the questions. And the main thing as well in job interviews is that they tend to be more about social skills. So, if you're an introvert, it's more of an issue because you're not really as expressive or as loud as a neurotypical person. And a lot of employers prefer people who are extroverted and bubbly and someone who's smiling all the time. And again, the same thing probably applies in terms of looks, because if, say, you're doing a front-facing job, most employers are going to pick a person that's not only bubbly in terms of greeting clients, but they're going to pick somebody that has the looks because they want that person to represent the company. And that's the thing, is that autistic people can be at a disadvantage when it comes to these things. So they don't really have much of a chance to sort of prove themselves, if they make sense. So the third issue I'm going to be discussing is lack of accommodations. So when it comes to accommodations, obviously it costs money for an employer to adjust the inner workings of a workplace. And it can be very difficult for autistic people to get accommodation because if, say, they're undiagnosed, they might not know what they need. And if they are, and they mention that they need certain things, employers might not want to invest because their main priority is money. And in some cases, depending on the type of accommodations as well, you have certain employers that will view that person as the type who's getting special treatment. And it's the same thing with other co-workers. And because of these types of issues, you have lots of autistic people that don't really have the confidence to ask for support. So if, say, for example, you've got an autistic person working in like an open plan office and it's distracting due to fluorescent lighting and constant noise in terms of co-workers talking, typing, co-workers going into your personal space, they might want a cubicle because having a space to themselves makes it easier for them to concentrate on their work. But depending on the employer, they might not want to invest in a cubicle because, for one, it's going to cost too much money. And then two, if that person is needed for something, it could be hard to reach them. And the same thing applies if the autistic individual had, say, noise cancelling earbuds to help regulate noise levels if noise in itself is too distracting. That's also another problem. And to add to accommodations as well, I suppose what I mentioned earlier in regards to the amount of hours an autistic person can work for kind of comes into this, because as I was mentioning in the beginning, you have a lot of autistic people that cannot function in full-time jobs. So you have some who are working in part-time jobs that could be less than 25 hours a week. You have some who are unemployed. You even have some who are self-employed, and they find self-employment better because if you're self-employed, you're managing your own business and you're managing your own schedule. So it's not like you have a manager delegating duties directly to you and constantly checking in. You are responsible for your own business. And, in some cases as well, depending on the autistic person, they might even end up working in voluntary services because they can't get a paid job. And for some, working in a voluntary service is actually a good thing because when you do volunteer work, you can help people, even people that might have similar needs to yourself. So for autistic people that do work in full-time jobs, depending on their needs, they might be able to cope, but only if they do a hybrid job where they do a few days on a site and a few days at home, or a job where they just work from home. And depending on the person, they would probably prefer a job with minimal contact. So no huge teams, no open plan offices or sites where you have to be involved with so many people, just a small team or just yourself and a manager, something along those lines, because it helps. And, in the case of those that are unemployed as well, you do have a lot of autistic people, as per mentioned, who are on benefits because they can't find a job that suits them. And there is a stigma in the UK relating to benefits as well. So, we have a bit of a classist mentality in which if you're on benefits, you are seen as a scrounger or a parasite. And what doesn't help is the mainstream media pushing this narrative, as well as the government, who are trying to act as if they're helping disabled people as a whole get back into work, when really what they want to do is kill off that population, which is sad. And what doesn't help as well, if you're autistic, is if you're struggling to find a job and you're on benefits and you have an unsympathetic work coach, then that just causes more anxiety because this work coach might not understand your needs. They will throw you into any old job, like, a warehousing job or a care home job, because they need to fill a quota. They need to tick boxes so they can reduce their caseloads, and that's it. So when it comes to autism and work in itself, as per mentioned, it can be very difficult for autistic people to keep jobs because there are so many things that are unexpected. There are so many things that are not clear, like instructions, for example. So with autistic people, and this is probably coming from my own experience, they need full clarification on what kind of tasks they have to do, what deadlines they've got, how to do a specific thing, etc. So if an autistic person is working in an office and they have to send a spreadsheet to person X in an email, and they send that spreadsheet as per the instruction of the manager, and then person X says, no, you have to send this to person Y, then the autistic individual gets really confused. And what tends to happen is they second guess themselves and they're blamed for an honest mistake that they didn't mean to make. And then I guess what tends to happen is you feel like you have all these voices just coming at you because you have multiple people telling you how to do your job. And I've had experiences before, especially in my previous workplace, where I've made honest mistakes and I'm second guessing myself because sometimes there's instances where I'm doing a task, I know how to do it, and then everything just goes haywire because I'm being told I'm doing something wrong. And I want to know what I've done wrong and what I can do to pretty much alleviate the issue. So, I just get so confused. It gets to a point where I'm just thinking, I cannot do my job properly. And speaking of jobs as well, office politics is another issue that comes into play with autism at work, because with autistic people, a lot of them, again, depending on needs, find it very difficult to pick up on social cues. So, with neurotypical people, you have a lot of them that are not really upfront. So you can't really tell if they're happy with you or if they're upset with you and things like that. And with autistic people, they don't really like to be involved in office politics because, you have certain instances where it leads to things like bullying, mobbing, etc. And as a lot of people say, modern workplaces are like the equivalent of high school environments. So it's like you have the group of popular kids and you're just kind of the outcast that wants to figure them out, but you don't know how. And when office politics takes place, you have no idea how to deal with it as an autistic person because, you can have somebody be nice in front of you and be very nasty to you behind your back or do things behind your back. And it frustrates you because you're trying to figure out what you're doing wrong and you can't really anticipate what happens as well, which is another problem. And on top of that, if an autistic person wants to just do their job well, do their required hours, leave and get paid, that's always a problem because, you have a lot of autistic people that are very socially awkward. I know because I am socially awkward and it takes a long time for me to get used to people. And, when autistic people are forced into social activities at work, they just get so fatigued and then they could faint or feel faint. And I know how that feels because I've had experiences in general where I've attended social events and I just can't be there. I just can't give all my energy because it becomes physically and emotionally exhausting, And to add to office politics, asserting yourself as an autistic person is another difficult thing because if, say, you do have office politics taking place, as an autistic individual, you might deal with things by people pleasing. And this is something I used to do myself in my teens in particular. So with people pleasing, it's like you're sacrificing your health and well-being for someone else, and it's like you are in a position where you're basically trying to do whatever you can to make someone else happy whilst compromising your own happiness. And because there's that issue of potentially facing confrontation, it's so hard to say no. So that's why you kind of resort to this people-pleasing nature, because you don't want to be confronted. You don't want someone being, rude to you. You don't want someone gaslighting you. You don't want someone bullying you. So you just kind of, leave things as they are and just try to get on. But then sometimes as well, if you are an autistic individual and you're facing issues in the workplace and you're trying your best to make yourself be heard, then it doesn't work, because you've got co-workers and toxic managers in a lot of modern workplaces that will bully the shit out of you to a point where you end up quitting your job. And then what tends to happen is that the person who is being the aggressor stays, because the employer prefers them to someone who just wants to do their job well. And it does happen in a lot of toxic workplaces. It really does. So, in most cases, employers just want someone that says yes to everything, someone that doesn't complain, and someone that accepts mistreatment. And another thing to add as well is, for a lot of autistic people, as per mentioned in earlier parts, they tend to get through work days by masking, or they might resort to recreational drugs or alcohol because it changes their whole personality. And it's the only way they can cope. And this applies to neurotypical people as well, of course, but you do have autistic people that resort to recreational drug use and such, because it's kind of that thing that helps them, it just helps them be more neurotypical so that they can be accepted and fit in. Now, another thing I'm going to mention as well, which I've probably discussed a little bit, is how autistic people should be supported when it comes to finding the right job. So, as I mentioned before, it's very difficult for autistic people, depending on their needs and where they are on the spectrum, to find the right job. So, you might have some who are good in the education industry, some could be good in the retail industry, the arts, etc. It all depends on what it is they want to do, what skills and experience they've got, qualifications, etc. Now, when it comes to finding a job, you do have instances where a lot of autistic people need something that doesn't have any unexpected surprises. So an ideal job, aside from one where they don't have to socialize with a lot of people, is a job with a set routine, something that has consistent hours Monday to Friday. So if, say, an autistic person was to do a 35-hour work week, they would do 7 hours a day, Monday to Friday, no overtime, nothing like that. And that routine basically sits well with them, because they know, okay, I have to go in for this time to this time on this day, this day, this day, and this day. And on top of that, having an environment where you have an appropriate setup kind of helps. So if you're autistic and, for example, you're not used to change and you wanted to work in an office where hot desking is normalized might not be the best setup, because with hot desking, this is where you have like a random desk every single day, if that makes sense. So one day you could be sitting on a desk next to, I don't know, a front door. The other day you could be sitting at the back if someone else is sitting in what you think is your seat. But then if you have the same desk where everything is laid out the same way, it helps. So like where I work, although being front and center as a receptionist can be a bit nerve-wracking, I like the fact that I am fixed to a desk. The same desk Monday to Friday, because I know how my setup looks every single day. I don't have to change it, and that is a good thing. And even where I used to work, despite working in an open plan office, which oddly enough I'm used to, in a sense, as I've never really worked in an actual cubicle per se, I still had a fixed desk. And I think that kind of helps because I know where to put everything and nothing changes. You know, the only instance where things change in my current job in terms of like my desk setup, which isn't really a glaring issue, is if I have a meeting and I have to go into an interview room or something, or if I have training and I have to go off site in another area, which is normal. But the point is, having a consistent setup with reasonable accommodations is helpful. And another thing to add as well is an autistic person would benefit with a supportive employer, one that can basically sit down with them and just work on an effective plan that helps them get through the day. So if an autistic person feels like they're going to have a meltdown at work, having a designated area where they could take a breather helps. So that's something that I do when I feel like I'm fatigued from sitting on my desk for too long, and I've discussed that with my manager at work because I have explained that I have fatigue. So if I'm staring at a screen for too long, I feel like I'm zoning out. So I have to get up and just, have that 10-minute breather, and then I can go back and focus. Either that or having clear instructions like steps, which helps as well. And if, say, you're required to use specific tools or software, having visual demonstrations because you can log in things better. And of course, a last point to add is depending on personal experiences, if autistic people are level 1 on the spectrum, aka high functioning, they would have more of a chance to cope in jobs because they typically look neurotypical. Again, this depends. And level 2 and 3 depends as well because obviously those are lower on the spectrum and further support would be required, especially because there's difficulties with searching for the right job, filling in an application, preparing for an interview, etc. And unless there is someone guiding that person, they would struggle. And like I said, I think it's important for autistic people to get supported in the workplace and not just to exist to fill a quota, because if they get the right support from the right people, they have just as much of a chance to thrive. So this is the end of today's episode. I hope you have all enjoyed it. And of course, I'm going to be releasing the next episode on the 2nd of June, as I have an every 2-week schedule for consistency and such. So on the 2nd of June, the next episode is going to be about autism and depression. So I'm going to be delving more into my experiences of living with depression, how it affects me, how I try to manage it, etc. So I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and I would really appreciate, as always, if you could leave some feedback for me in terms of what you think of the topics, as well as how to improve the quality of my podcast, as I do want to make sure that I am providing valuable content. And until next time, this is Brie, and I hope you all have a good day, and I will see you soon. Bye!